Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Esme, and I'm a producer for the How To Academy. And you've joined us today for our first Inkspots events with Katherine Rundell. Katherine is the best-selling author of 5 fantastic children's books, which I'm sure many of you will have read already. Katherine is going to give a short talk this morning, and then it will be over to you to interview her. So please put lots of questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. So without any more from me, please join me in welcoming Katherine Rundell.
Hello, thank you so much all for being here in the morning. It's an absolute thrill to be talking to you all. I'm going to talk really fast because there's so many things I want to talk about, and I also want to leave lots of time for questions because I love being asked questions by children. So I'm going to share my screen to show you some pictures that explain a little bit of something about how one might go about writing. So this is a picture of one of the tributaries of the Amazon River, and I decided a few years ago that I wanted to write a story about children who crash land an aeroplane in the Amazon rainforest, and it's called The Explorer. At first they survive entirely alone, and then they find a map, and the map leads them down the river on a raft until they find a ruined city, and in the city there's a man. And he won't tell them his name, so they just call him the Explorer. And he has a secret, but I won't tell you what the secret is. But one of the most wonderful things about writing stories is that you get to go to places that you would have longed to go to anyway. And you get to see things, and you get to write it down. I always carry a notebook with me, and it's like taking notes about beauty. And you see things which astonish you. So for instance, I think it looks so quiet and peaceful on that river, but in fact, there was so much under the water that I wouldn't have expected. For instance, there are, I'm sure many of you guys know this, there are in the Amazon River dolphins, and the dolphins in the Amazon River are pink, wild river dolphins. And the first time I saw these, I was just utterly astonished. And in fact, in this photograph, you can see I'm completely soaked to the skin, even though I'm fully clothed. And that's because just before this photograph was taken, a pod of pink wild river dolphins came swimming under the boat. And even though we were wearing all our clothes, we just pulled off our boots and dived after them. And that feeling of being maybe this far away from a beautiful, strange, wild creature. That was one of the things that I wanted to fill my books with. I wanted to fill them with a sense of the world being enormous and full of unexpected, hidden beauties and things which turn out to be other than you think. For instance, we were told that it was safe to jump in after the dolphins, even though the water was full of piranhas, because we were told that the speed of the current would be so fast they wouldn't know how to bite us, they'd just be confused. And I was a little bit nervous, but I really wanted to swim with the dolphins, so I thought I'm just going to hope that all the piranhas are confused and they haven't like formed a think tank or, you know, established a reading group and got cleverer. And as you can see, I was not eaten by piranhas because here I am on Zoom. So instead of being eaten by piranhas, we ate the piranhas, and the piranhas turned out to be quite delicious. They taste a little bit like chicken. And it's another thing that I love about writing stories. And if anyone listening today is themselves a budding writer, something to remember is this. If you find yourself writing a story and it's incredibly wild and unlikely, one of the best things you can do is add food, because when you add food and you make it sound delicious, the person reading starts to feel physically hungry. So what you've done is you've rooted the sort of imaginary world up in your imagination in the physical world of someone's body, and you've made it feel deeply real. And so that's why if you read any of my books, there's always lots of food in them, and I always try to eat the food in real life myself, so that I can make sure that it's real. So for instance, if you want to, you can watch a video of me eating a tarantula by Googling Katherine Rundell tarantula, which is me fact checking the tarantulas that they eat in the story, The Explorer. But then there are other things that I love about writing stories, about writing adventure stories. I've always wanted to write books that sort of grab you by the wrist and pull you along and won't let you go. So for instance, often the research that you get to do for those stories, just a fantastic amount of fun. So for instance, I went to meet Wolf when I was writing The Wolf Wilder. And there were all these things that I discovered about her. She's called Madder and she lives in the borderlands of Wales. And she doesn't smell like a dog. I think she looks like a massive dog, but not when she moves, because she's got these humps of muscle along her back and her eyes are different. And she smells of dust and of ice and of blood. And so I wanted to get my wolves as real as possible when I wrote The Wolf Wilder, which is a book about a girl and a boy who ride half tame, half wild wolves across the snowy plains of Russia to rescue their mother from the Tsar. And then sometimes you don't go looking for your stories. Sometimes the stories come at you without warning. So for instance, I wrote a book called Rooftoppers about children who live up on the rooftops of Paris. And the idea for that story came to me while I was up on a roof. I have another job, which is that I hold a research fellowship at an Oxford college called All Souls College in Oxford. And I research mostly Shakespeare and John Donne, a great Renaissance poet who lived about 400 years ago. But when I first got there, I was told a secret, which is that there was a trap door above the lavatory, above the library. And if you pushed it open, you could come crawling up one of those towers and out onto the rooftops. And it was while I was up on the rooftop with a friend at about 2 o'clock in the morning, because you have to go at night, because technically it's completely illegal. And I really feel I should sort of say, please don't try this at home, kids. Very dangerous. While we were up there, we discovered an empty glass bottle of beer. And we were like, why is there a bottle of beer on a rooftop? That makes no sense at all. It can't have blown up there because it's very heavy. And I started thinking, what if someone has been living up on the rooftop of All Souls College and we don't notice because we always forget to look up? As you can probably guess, there was no one living on the rooftop of All Souls College. In fact, someone had come up to fix roof tiles years before and had taken a picnic with a beer and had forgotten to take the bottle back down. But that beginning, that what if, that maybe, that possibility is, I think, one of the best ways to think about writing a story. So if you find yourself wanting to write a story, think what if. It's how adventures begin. What if you went through a wardrobe and on the other side there was a lion and a witch and snow? Or what if you were a wizard who had to defeat the world's most evil wizard? And what if anything? You can start asking yourself hundreds of what ifs, and one of them will become a story. I want to talk briefly about my most recent book. It's called The Good Thieves. And this book is set in New York City. And it's about a girl who discovers that something has been stolen from her grandfather, that everything that he owns has been taken from him by a notorious New York con man called Victor Soratore. And she arrives in New York, and it's the 1920s. And at that point, it was very hard to get justice unless you had money. And she knows they're trying to find a lawyer, but they called one. And so she decides that she is going to steal back the things that were stolen from her grandfather, which makes them good thieves, people stealing back that which was taken. But she knows that in order to do this, she needs to break into this old ruined building. So she's going to need someone who can get up and over the wall, someone good at climbing, someone who can tame the guard dogs, and someone who can pick a lock. And so this is the story of how she puts together a crack team in order to fight for the person she loves for most. And I decided that I wanted it to be set in New York because New York is a city full of secrets. New York is a city full of strangeness. If you turned it upside down and shook it, such strange things would fall out, especially in the 1920s. Flappers and con men and brilliant music. And I thought, where would you find people with brilliant skills? And I thought, well, one place, not the only place, but one place might be a circus. And so I started to research the circus in New York. And I found this in the New York Times, circus in Carnegie Hall. Elephants, ponies, dogs, and other familiar attractions of the Tanbark is just a posh way of saying circus, will be seen in Carnegie Hall this season, which means that in real life, there were elephants in Carnegie Hall. And so I started researching that. I thought, well, this is Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall is one of the smartest and very prim, beautiful concert halls in the whole of America. And it's where people go in their black ties and long dresses to listen to music. I thought an elephant walked into Carnegie Hall, and I thought, that's amazing. So I started researching it, and I started finding all these amazing pictures of times in which huge circuses would parade through New York City. And there are some of the elephants. But I also knew that I didn't want the boy, there's going to be a boy in the story who is attached to the circus and to animal taming. But he doesn't want elephants to perform because elephants are not born or bred to perform. They don't want to work, to be wild. So his circus, this boy, Arcady, the boy who has a magic touch with animals, his dream is to have a circus made only of creatures that love to work. And I thought that one of the things that he would have in his circus is crows. And one of the things that he would have as part of the crime would be crows, because crows are some of the cleverest animals in the world. Crows can operate vending machines. This is a picture of a crow which has been trained at an amusement park in France to pick up litter and fly it into the nearest bin. But they've been trained to do it in front of the person who just dropped the litter. So you're being publicly shamed by a crow. And I just thought that was spectacular. And so I started reading more about crows, and I read about this little girl who lives in Seattle, and she started bringing the crows food, and in return, they started bringing her gifts, these things you can see, little bits of glass, paper clips, and they would leave them on the windowsill or at her feet or occasionally in her hand. And so if you read The Good Thieves, you'll see a scene where a girl called Silk, Susanna, but she doesn't want to be called that, so Silk, gets arrested and put in a police cell. And the thing that managed to break her out is not one of the children. The thing that helps her escape is a crow. And then there are other things that I knew I wanted to have in my story. For instance, I knew that I wanted to have someone who would be brilliant with heights. And I thought, again, the circus might be the right place for that. Somebody who was training to be a trapeze artist, the finest young trapeze artist. So he's called Samuel Kwadza, and this is a man called Jules Lyotard. The reason I'm showing you a picture of him is nothing to do with my book. I just love that he is the man who invented the flying trapeze and also the leotard. So if ever you do gymnastics and you're a girl and you wear that leotard, it is named after this man with the moustache, Jules Lyotard. But I knew that I wanted my Samuel, the boy, to be someone who moved through the air as if gravity had made an exception just for him. And so I thought, if I want him to be a great trapeze artist, someone who can climb up over a wall, who can swing, I'm going to have to find out what it's like to fly on the flying trapeze. So I started taking lessons. There's a place in London near Regent's Park where before COVID, you were able to learn how to fly on the flying trapeze. And I never got very good at it, but I did learn the most spectacular feelings that it brings you, that you fly through the air and you catch someone's hands. And I think it is the closest we can get to feeling what it might really be to fly. And then you do things like triple backflip dismounts, and it's all much easier because you have gravity swinging you. Although there was one day when I tried to do something a bit ambitious, sort of, I don't know, 4 backflips before I landed, and I landed straight on my face and sort of scraped half the skin off my cheek. So I guess being a writer sometimes comes with perils, which I guess I should factor in. And then the final thing that I knew I wanted to have in my story would be a pickpocket. And her name is Silk. She's the girl who got arrested. And she is someone who can pick any lock and reach things from people's pockets. And she is based on a real life man called Apollo Robbins. And in real life, Apollo Robbins can pickpocket anything. These days, he's not a criminal. These days, he works in Las Vegas and you have to pay a lot of money to get pickpocketed by him. But there's a scene in the book which is stolen entirely from his real life abilities, where he puts £50 in a wallet on this side and a pen on this side in your pocket. And then he'll chat to you for maybe a minute or two, maybe ruffle your hair. And then he'll say, can you give me the £50? And you can't because it's gone. And you think, that's quite impressive. And then he says, can you sign your name? And you can't because he's taken your pen, taken out the ink, rolled up the £50, put it inside the pen, screwed the pen back, put it back in, all without you seeing his hands moving. And that is the kind of skill that I wanted Silk, the girl in the book, to have. So if you read the book and you think that sounds impossible, it's actually very possible because this man can do it. And that's the space that I want my books to operate in. I want them to be books that are just barely possible, unlikely adventures that would be just workable. Sort of, I ask myself, like I said, what if? What if there was a girl who had the kind of spectacular abilities that this man, Apollo Robbins, had? How would she move through the world? What would it mean for her life? What would it mean for the things she wants? Would she start to feel anxious about stealing things? Would she start to want a different kind of life? And those are the stories which, the questions which start to power your story. And then finally, the thing that I knew I wanted in my story was speakeasies. Now, in New York, in the 1920s, it was illegal to sell or drink alcohol. And so instead, people started hiding their pubs and bars underground, and they would hide them behind bookshelves and behind pharmacies and behind all sorts of shops. My one is an underwear shop. And behind doors like this, you would get parties that looked like this. And the reason I wanted these that look like this is at parties that look like this, you've got people like this. This is Al Capone, one of the most notorious gangsters in American history. And I wanted my character, Victor Soratore, to be based a little bit on him. Somebody who cares about nothing except profit, and somebody who is willing to do anything to make money and gain power. And my 4 children, Silk, Arcady, the animal tamer, Samuel, the trapeze artist, and Vita, the girl with the plan, go up against him. And that is the building blocks of the story that became The Good Thieves. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to see if anyone has any questions, because I always love hearing questions.
Well, there are lots of questions. Thank you everyone who sent them in early as well. Always good to hand them in early, and lots of people asking them still now. So we've got some about writing and then some about your books and your characters. So maybe we'll start with the writing ones, if that's all right. So I'm just going to jump straight in. I hope that's okay. So Iris, she's 9, and she wants to know how old you were when you wrote your first book, or have you always written stories?
So when I first wrote my first book that was published, I was 21 years old. But when I wrote my first book, I was about 6 or 7. And I wrote it as a present for my dad, and it was called Sally's Surprise. And I found it recently, and I sewed a cover for it with little stars. So it's covered in blood because I kept jabbing myself with a needle. And the surprise in Sally's Surprise is nothing happens. Like, surprise, there's no plot. It's a lot of descriptions of horses. So in some ways it's very avant-garde. But I would say I have always been someone who wanted to write stories, and who, when I saw something I loved, wanted to write it down, because that seemed to me the best way to keep it. Because life is so finite. We just get this one life, and there is so much that is remarkable and beautiful, and it is so easy to forget things. And so I've always been a person who wants to scribble things down. And if I have a notebook, I have this notebook with me almost everywhere I go. I have a big red school notebook where I make my notes, or I just use the notes function on my iPhone if I don't have my notebook with me. And so I would say, if you are a child watching this and you don't know what to give your parents for a present, writing them a story would be one of the things I absolutely promise you that they would love most. Because my dad kept Sally's Surprise from when I was 7 to when I am now at 33. And it's not because it was great literature, it's because I wrote it for him, because I loved him. And so I think if you guys think, what should I do with a day? And you find yourself at a loose end, write a story for someone you love.
Great advice. Jess, who's 24, she said she's a fellow writer, and she wants to know, since writing your first book, has your writing process changed at all? And has it got easier or has it got harder?
Harder. I think My first book, the advantage you have is maybe some people write a first book with a contract, but I wrote a first book just to see if anyone would publish it when it was finished. So I imagined no one would ever read it. And so I didn't write with an imaginary audience. Now I write knowing that I have this wonderful stroke of luck, which is that some people read my books, and that is both the great glory, but it means that I think it is also a duty of care and a duty, you know, I work for people, I work for children, they are my bosses. And I think that makes things sometimes more complicated, that I have to think about what might tell people the truth. I think that when you're a children's writer, you have the duty to tell the truth about both light and dark, not to pretend that the world is full of delight, because fear and loss are very real, but hope is also a truth. And so I always want to make sure that my books have hope and adventure and the idea of children being pushed right to the end of themselves, because in my experience in real life, when you are pushed right to the end of yourself, you discover just how far you can go.
Well, you're an incredibly adventurous person. And Peter, who's 11, asked a great question. He asked, did your childhood freedom inspire any of your characters' freedom?
I think a little bit, yes. I was so lucky to have this childhood in which my parents allowed me to play by myself and with my friends without adult supervision. And that's really hard to do. And it was much easier for us then because I grew up in Zimbabwe, where there is more space, and it wasn't as built up a city as somewhere like London. But I think that kind of freedom, the freedom of being allowed to play with friends without adults watching you, that I think makes its way into a lot of the adventures in the stories. So for instance, Sophie in Rooftoppers, who one day just climbs up onto the rooftop and just goes exploring, just goes to see what is out there. I think that sense that she has of wanting to see the world, I think that is probably something that was installed on me very young by my parents.
Yes, Isabel, who's 10, asks which of your characters is most like you in real life, but they all sound so wonderful and adventurous. They must all be a bit like you.
Well, they're all much braver than me. This is the thing as well. I remember the brilliant writer, a friend of mine called Piers Torday, talking about writing characters as a little bit like playing the organ. Because when you play the organ, you can play high notes and very low notes, but it's all the same instrument. So he was saying, when you write a really evil character, it still has a lot of your own heart in it, because the only human heart we really know is our own. So when you're writing an evil character, it's your own self with a lot of like really dark notes added. And when you're writing a hero, it's a lot of your own self with a lot of really bright notes added. And so I think probably all of my characters, including the boys, including the villains, have quite a lot of me in them. Probably the one who is most like me is Theo in The Wolfwilder, because of her stubbornness and the fact that she gets easily embarrassed, that she wants to sort of plunge her head in the snow because she's so nervous, but she also has a certain amount of sort of stubborn determination. But I definitely would not be brave enough to ride a wolf or start a revolution. So in those ways, not like me.
Hannah and Toby asked the same question. They want to know, how do you get the ideas for the very unusual names of your characters?
Most of the names in my books are taken from people that I meet or know or love in real life. For instance, in Rooftoppers, the boy who lives on top of Notre Dame de Paris is called Gerard. My brother that's his name. He's Jared in English and Gerard in French. The two sisters who live in the trees, called Safi and Anastasia, based on my cousins who are called Saffron and Anastasia, who are Russian. And so I often pick names from people I love, or sometimes just people I meet who have beautiful names. And I say to them in signing cues, I love your name. Can I steal it for a book?
What an honor. Minnie, who's 7, she wants to know, which of your characters would you most like to hang out with? Because she said that she'd like to hang out with Safi, Anastasia, Will and Sophie.
That is a really lovely question. I would like to hang out with Charles in Rooftoppers, because I think that he would be really good company and probably a good cook.
Excellent hot chocolate, of course. Tal, who's 9, asked, would you ever want any of your books to be made into film or television shows? She said she'd like to see Girls Savage as a film.
That is a lovely question. So the way the film industry works is you sell the rights to your book. So someone can make a film for it if they want to, but making a film costs millions and millions of pounds. So although I have sold the rights for quite a few of my books, they might become films. And I wrote the script for one of them. You just never know if it's going to happen. So the thing that all writers learn after time is keep hoping, but don't count on it.
Ursula asked a great question. She said, did you ever consider any other career path?
I did. There were so many things I wanted to be. Ever since I've known that books were written by people and not things that sort of grew organically like trees, I have always wanted to be a writer, because it seemed to me that writing is just dreaming things up that you would love to happen or would not love to happen, but would love to see what might happen, and then writing them down. But there were other things that I absolutely adored. I wanted to be an acrobat, but was not really a good enough acrobat to pull that off. An architect, a professional eater, if that was a thing. I was very into food, but I can't cook. So just someone who eats a lot professionally, tragically not a job. There were many things. And also I thought for a long time about being an academic, because I did do a PhD and I did teach at Oxford University, and I did love teaching students about the plays of Shakespeare, because when you can make someone fall in love with something that you already love, that feels like a triumph. But for now, I would just like to be a writer.
There are so many questions. Thank you everyone for sending them in. Lots are about if you have a favourite period of history and why you choose to set lots of your book in a certain period of the past.
I think it's because I have a specific idea for a story, and that's the period it seems to fit. So for instance, The Wolf Wilder is set around 1905 because that's the period that makes sense in history, because it's a sort of alternative sense of history in which Theodora starts the Russian Revolution. But then, for instance, Rooftoppers, it made sense to me to have it at the beginning of the 20th century, 19 something. I never quite say on purpose, but you can work it out because you can work out which buildings already existed. So for instance, the Eiffel Tower is there, which means it's after 1890. I think sometimes history helps because children don't have cell phones and there's no CCTV, so it's more easy to create a story in which wild adventures can happen. But also sometimes there's a kind of clarity that you can have by working in the past. For instance, in The Good Thieves, I wanted it to be set in that moment because New York sort of crystallized its character in that moment. New York was very much a dangerous and thrilling and beautiful and exciting and difficult place to be. And I wanted to reflect that in all its ways in the story.
Another question, which is a great one, which is what books did you like when you were growing up and which authors would you recommend? Who are your favourites?
So my favourite authors, the one who I always talk about because she's the one that fewest people know. I did love Roald Dahl and I did love Harry Potter, but I loved wildly a writer called Diana Wynne Jones. And some people know her, but not enough people do. I think that she is the greatest writer of fantasy for children, maybe ever. She is so funny and sardonic and sarcastic. And she wrote a book called Charmed Life and a book called Howl's Moving Castle, which was made into a movie. And when I first started going into schools a long time ago now, because I've been writing for 12 years, I started saying to children, if you read Charmed Life by Diana Wynne Jones and you don't enjoy it, write to me and I'll send you chocolate in the post. And I got these huge numbers of fabulous emails and letters from children saying, I read Charmed Life by Diana Wynne Jones and I regret to inform you that I loved it. And it was just a complete delight. And then one child wrote to me saying, go on, send me some Maltesers, I didn't like it.
That is such a good way to get people reading. We have so many questions coming in and I don't think we have time for any more, but I just want to say thank you for everyone for joining us today, and thank you so much, Katherine. If you've enjoyed today, we have lots of extra talk coming up. We've got Michael Morpurgo, we've got Crested Cal from How to Train Your Dragon, we've got amazing people coming, so do see if you can sign up to any more. It'd be great to have lots more of your curious questions coming in. Katherine, thank you so much, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your weekend. It's been a pleasure listening to your amazing stories.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone who came. And thank you for asking questions. And have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.